going to test. How's that for you guys? Okay, and if anyone's watching online and has any issue with sound, just give us a little wave in the chat and JJ can adjust that. Thank you for coming to today's Book Fringe event with Ania Card for the astonishing, brilliant, devastating novel that is Above Us, The Sea. And I sometimes get nervous about a very big book these days because I don't have a huge amount of time. But if it was a page shorter, I would have been even more devastated. This is an extraordinary novel, and it is also available, just as a wee shout out, on Libro FM. So if you are an audiobook listener, the performance of this book is also really beautiful. And we can give you hot tips at the till on how to get Libro if you like the audiobooks too. I'm going to do a wee intro from your bio that is in the back of the book. Then I'm going to ask some questions, and then you can ask some questions, and then the people who are online can ask some questions. But before I do that, will you all put your hands together and welcome today's author, Ania Card. Ania grew up in southeastern Poland before moving to the UK. She lived in Cardiff and London before moving to Brighton, where she now lives with her husband and cat. She studied film theory at King's College London and worked in film production before returning to writing Above Us, The Sea, which is her first novel. And so I'm going to start by asking you to set the scene for us, just a brief introduction to the book itself, your gorgeous characters, and then a little reading.
Thanks again to everyone for coming and listening online as well. So the way I always talk about Above Us, The Sea is it is a coming-of-age queer immigrant novel, and it follows Toni, who's a Polish immigrant in Cardiff, who meets Gav, who's Welsh, he's an ex-boxer, and they meet on a night out, and they sort of immediately fall in love with each other. And then through Gav, she meets Karol, who's Gav's boyfriend, who's also Polish, he's a photographer, and they sort of fall into this ambiguous sort of love triangle, sort of a really romantic friendship, and then stuff happens, like the tragedy sort of strikes, and sort of the rest of the book is really about them sort of finding themselves and each other, and it's about sort of Toni's, I guess, like kind of growing up through grief, growing up in a second language, growing up in a second culture, but also coming to terms, exploring her sexuality, and yeah, so I guess that's how I would sum it up.
Can you give us a flavour of the writing?
Yeah. So this is the first chapter, where we introduced in this fragment to Toni and Gav. I first met Gav 3 years ago on the dance floor of Pulse, Cardiff's loudest gay bar. Gav's face flickered in the whooping disco lights and his body whirred in a dance to the sounds of Divine, a lithe body wrapped tight in a velvet red turtleneck and black leather trousers, unrestricted in a spectrum of motion, drawing men around him close. I admired the freedom in his movement, free from all of us dancing, free from our eyes on him, his face drowned in sound, eyes closed, lips mouthing the words with a smile, as if he had never danced before, and the dance was the answer. It was all there was. I took a sip of my beer, dizzy with my new freedom clanging in my head, clumsy and heavy, so loud despite the music punching the air with beats, despite the eyes of women on me, despite the invitations, despite the sense of new territories palpable at the tip of my tongue, the particles of heat between bodies. It was all there was, freedom of everything finishing all at once. I glanced at a woman looking at me, afraid to make a move, to make a decision, struck by my stillness, keeping the future at bay, batting it away with another beer I took outside into the wet and mild Welsh winter. I looked at the swarms of men and women outside, groups guaranteeing safety. I moved to the edge of the beer garden, flanked by 2 circles of gossip and drama running with passion and detail funneling through my brain with images of people and places I didn't know. I took out the last cigarette I had haggled of a man on my way in and placed it between my lips, its taste always reliable. There he was again, and to my surprise he was walking straight towards me with a confident stride, heeled leather boots clumping against the cobblestones. "You look lost," said Gav, a warm Welsh voice reverberating around me. There was something in the way he was looking at me, as if he needed to rescue something that night, and here I was, everything he'd been waiting for. He had the kind, affectionate eyes of a rescuer, a frown of attention above them lining his high forehead beneath short blonde spikes trailed upwards. "Is it that obvious?" I smiled and asked for a lighter. "Come here," he said, bringing his face close to mine and cupping my cigarette with the palm of one hand. Cool December air pushed in between my face and his neck, the flickering lights behind him highlighting the angles of his face, bony and pointed, blue eyes sunk deep in the cheekbones, eyelids covered in golden glitter, eyeliner climbing high above each eye. "There you go," the flame struck. I inhaled and blew the smoke away from his face. "You're a beautiful dancer," I said. "Oh, thank you, pet." Thin lips spilled into a wide grin. "My God, I've missed it," he said and frowned in my direction. "Having a look around tonight?" I smiled. Was I having a look? I had never dared to look. "Maybe," I said, acting coy when everything in my body screamed in fear. "I'm Gav," he said, holding the cigarette by his face, head tilted to the side. "I'm Toni. Are you a student here?" he asked, grabbing my hand and walking us away from the cackling voices, snaking to the quieter corner with a cha-cha step. "That's better now." "I was," I said, my voice louder, the statement definitive, pushing me forward. "I quit today." Gav's eyes widened at the revelation. "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know," I said, forcing a smile, hoping smoke concealed fear. I looked around, stamping the cigarette to the floor. I hated every minute of my degree. I had to break free, you know? Gav's face flashed with something else. Eyes narrowed, inspecting me closely. In recognition, something in his face longing. "What is it like to be free, then?" he asked. I looked down, teetering on my feet. "Right now," I said, "it's mostly scary." Gav squeezed my hand and looked away, smoke dispersing into the starry night, his grip strong, wiry hand enveloping mine. "Let's dance, darling," he said, pulling me gently towards the music. "Let's dance."
Thank you for that. It's so nice to have you all introduced to the two of them. I fell in love with them so completely, the way they fell in love with each other. I'm going to ask you how this story came to you, or how you came to this story. Maybe a bit about the writing process and how that plays into that.
So I'm not really a plotter, so I didn't really have a story in mind when I started. I was sort of playing around with autofiction and thinking about my 20s, or just 20s in general, and sort of ways to summarize it somehow. And then I sort of very quickly arrived at Toni. I think she was always Toni and Gav. And I knew that I wanted to write something about the friendship between them, and kind of romantic friendship, and the friendship that really feels like love. And sort of really explore the relationships sort of we make in our early 20s, how strong those feelings are. So that was my starting point. But very quickly the boyfriend came up, and as soon as I knew, so sort of through in draft zero still, but as soon as I sort of figured out that I wanted him to be Polish, that was my story then. I wanted to explore not only queerness and that relationship, but also sort of Eastern Europeanness in the UK, and look at that as well, and that love triangle instantly felt like, yes, that's it. That's what the core of the story is.
You explore all those things really beautifully. The idea of home and family is so intricately woven. And like I said, I felt that love story in my bones, and these queer platonic bones, this sense of chosen family, but also of chosen home in a physical place, trying Toni's pursuit of home, the way they find home in each other. I wonder if what drew you to those particular ideas, these ways of loving. How did you want the reader to encounter those?
I guess it's something that's always been really important in my life. In a way, I never really felt like I fit in Poland, where I was from, and I always struggled to really belong in any groups, in terms of my family and like sort of friendships as well. And I never really felt like I truly fit in sort of heteronormative norms in Poland. I'm from a very sort of conservative Catholic part of the country as well, and so the chosen home and chosen family is always something that's just, I think I'll always be writing about that because it's been such a huge part of my life. And when I arrived in Cardiff, moved to the UK, that is my chosen home. I chose to come here, and the queer community in Cardiff was the first place and the first group of people that I felt like I could really truly belong to and I felt part of. And yes, that's something that's been just on a very personal level, very close to me, and that's just been absolutely fundamental to my life and to how I see myself, to my identity. And such a broad thing as well, and I think they very much intersect one and each other. And I think you can explore it in so many different ways. It's just one way I went, with this story, I had to narrow it down all these ideas into the story of Toni, Gav and Karol. But I think, so I kind of wanted Toni to go through that journey of finding the people, finding herself, not necessarily arriving at the answers, because I think chosen family, chosen home, and also your identity, also your queerness can exist in a question, it doesn't have to be the answer. And I sort of wanted to explore that especially for Toni, because I think Gav and Karol are more sort of settled within themselves of who they are and their relationship as well. That's more conventional, the way that they, have a sexual romantic relationship together. But with Toni, I wanted to just sort of have her hang in there in the question.
I love that phrase, that sense of queerness is the question, not necessarily the answer. And the way that exists in the book is really beautiful. The cast of the novel was predominantly men, including many recognizable archetypes of gay and queer culture. And I wanted to ask you, because it also feels like, it's a deeply feminist novel. It's got a female protagonist, and this woman is the beating heart of it all. But how the men came to be to the forefront, and without spoilers, because it is unfortunately a book that could be spoilered quite easily, about any of the characters, the female characters in the book that you're attached to.
So it's so interesting too, because I kind of felt it as well when I was finishing the novel, that sort of in so many ways there were so many men, and I sort of had that thought of like, well, I wanted there to be more women, but just for the story, just I couldn't fit any more in. And there's a potential love interest for Toni, Joe, and in the initial draft, I'm not going to say what actually happens in the novel, but in the initial draft they have a relationship together that ends. But they have a whole story, and I love that bit. I still kind of actually miss it there, but then it just didn't work for the narrative as a whole and for what the story was about. And I guess, again, treading very sort of cautiously, not to spoil anything, but the sort of Toni's journey to finding herself and her queerness through, in a way as well, her relationship with Gav and Karol and the community in Cardiff, when she sort of escapes that, for reasons I will not disclose, she sort of falls into very heteronormative norms. I wanted to explore that sort of very conventional, unconventional family, and when you read it, you know what I mean. And sort of, again, the sort of men had to be there for that reason. But there's one woman that I smuggled in there. She was one of my favourite characters, and I loved writing her, Catherine. And she was just strong and confident and fabulous, and sort of and such a big, I think, actual sense of support and home for Toni that the men don't offer. And I think she's actually the only one who's really there for her, and in that way, yeah, probably it's the most important for the story, but like my personal favourite as well.
I like her getting a shout out. Yeah, because actually as a character, Toni is really pretty ambivalent about men in general, and they're sort of generally a bit threatening or uncomfortable to be around and thoroughly uninteresting, and then here they are. I guess my next question, while we're on the topic of not giving spoilers, I've given away that it's devastating, and the book did tear, like proper sobbing, tear me apart. You have an extraordinary prism for grief in this book and for loss, and one of the ways in which you explore it is the girl in the mirror. And so I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you approached writing about loss and grief.
Yeah, I guess Good Girl in the Mirror. So Toni almost like throughout the novels, I think she sort of is the person other people want her to be, and during that grieving period, it's so difficult not to spoil anything. I think that sense of detachment that's there with grieving and anxiety, and then complete sort of sense of loss of self, and when you just sort of grab onto anything, any identity you can steal and sort of morph into, because you're so broken and sort of shattered into million pieces, you can't form yourself really. And I thought that was the most sort of visual, also sort of felt true to me to explore it through that girl in the mirror. It's like the easy sort of reflection that she can sort of detach. She sort of almost erase herself in her mind. She can just be that persona, that creation. But thank you so much, because I sort of I based it, well, not on my experience, but I lived with quite like debilitating anxiety disorder for quite a few years, and so I wanted to re-explore that in a book in a very different ways, but because it's Toni's experience, not my experience, but how we cope with the loss of self in a way how you used to be when you're really, really almost, well, just complete, well, you're ill, really, you're struggling with an illness that completely changes yourself, the way you interact with others, kind of everything about you. And so you have to, I think, reconstruct yourself anew and find the ways. I think at the beginning, I tried to sort of explore with Toni as well, go back to how things were and what you were. But I think the way is always forward, and you have to sort of get through it to arrive at a place, and that has that grief, or maybe a part of you, or in my case it was anxiety disorder at the time, that sort of forms part of you always, and you sort of, the emotion is forward in your identity and the way you sort of interact with the world. So I was sort of drawing on a lot of my experience, even though the events were completely different. But I think feelings of loss and grief are very universal, can be applied to so many different situations in our life. Yeah.
And I think it captured so well, and is such a powerful reminder on the page of that way that through these moments so much becomes performance, and the way you crack through to see all of her was an interesting way of being reminded, yes, it's true, you can have someone who will crack the jokes at the dinner table, or be charming, be beautiful, be polished, and yet if you see them through just a different crack in the mirror, you see someone who's so broken. You capture that incredibly beautifully. one of the other things I loved about the book was the tapestry of the arts that there are in it. So you have music, like indie gigs and music scene. There's like the book sort of thrums with that, and then you've got film, you've got photography, and these aren't surface level like the characters watching a film. You're talking about making film, taking photographs. I wonder, is that a scene, are these art scenes that you exist in, or how did you research making them so intimate for the reader?
Well, thank you. Yeah, they were definitely very much a part of my life. Because I've never studied writing or literature, and I feel quite still new to the sort of book world. But with music's always been it's really present in my life. And I guess indie music, it was very, very broad term. But there were times in my life when I would be at the indie gig probably 3 times a week, and I just absolutely loved it, and I loved the community I had in London, sort of based around music for years. So I sort of wanted to, they sort of almost like in a book, it exists. Well, because it helps with Karol and his character and the relationship between Toni and Karol. Music was very central to their relationship, but also my personal Easter eggs, bands that sort of are no longer there, I loved, and I sort of wanted to just plug them in, just even anything for me to sort of to remember them and keep them sort of close, because I love them so much. So yeah, I wanted the book to be always like full of music, because it was so important in my life, and the club nights and the dancing, and it was just sort of, I also loved writing dancing scenes. I think one of my favourite things to write. And I studied film, so that's my background. So I studied film theory, and then I worked in production for a while. So in terms of theory, that sort of, it came in, I think, through the book, because I think lots of films were inspired my writing in general. And I think about writing very filmically, and I sort of refer back to films and I sort of go back. I love studying film theory, and I think it's always sort of present in the back of my head, and I think it is present in the book. And in terms of, because you mentioned the production, and like, so I worked in Soho as well, so that was the ease of, it was just easy to have Toni have those jobs, because it was interesting for me to go back and explore that world of post-production, production. But again, it was just a word I knew very, very well, so I felt like I could authentically write about it, that experience, and it tied in with everything else nicely, so it was quite useful knowing that. And photography, I actually don't know anything about, so I was very, very worried about sort of Karol's work, describing it. So I was just sort of researching, asking sort of friends, but yeah, that's where I was a bit of like a shaky ground of, yeah, I didn't have like the knowledge myself. So I'm glad it reads authentically on the page.
Well, someone who's not a photographer, but that sense of, even the photographs of her, the way you describe a photograph on the page or in a book or in an exhibition, I felt afterwards like I had wandered that gallery and seen those, and I'd seen I felt how exposed it would be to have those particular shots blown up on a wall or in a book in a gallery, and you capture that incredibly. I'm just going to do, it's very clunky, a time check, because we make these events nice. Okay, about 5 minutes. This is your cue to have your thinking caps on if you have questions. I'm going to just ask one more, and then I will throw it out to you, and anyone who's online can stick that in the chat. But just following on from that, are there artists in whatever of those fields that have either influenced the book that you want to give a shout out to, that have shaped you as an artist, or that you want readers to go away with as the next thing after this one?
I always mention it's my favourite film of all times, and it has influenced this book, influenced Karol as a photographer. I think it actually influenced photography in the book more than photography itself. And it's Blow Up by Michelangelo Antonioni. And I remember watching it in Cardiff as one of the sort of European cinema modules. And it just completely, I've never felt sort of this way after watching a film. I'm completely stunned by it. And we sort of talked about it afterwards as well. And it's really sort of questions the sort of the reality behind photography. Well, photography, but also like talks about art and abstract art and sort of what's real. So asked all these really, really big existential questions, but sort of really fun and cool film to watch. It's like in the 60s and it's sort of like swinging London and it's got that really amazing fun vibe. So it's got like, I think it's both, and that's sort of the space I always wanted to occupy as an artist, to be sort of in between there. So yeah, definitely give Blow Up a big shout out. It's a big inspiration.
Cool. Do we have any questions in the room? Don't be, yeah, there's one in the back. Go for it.
So this is a question from Lily online. They said, I think it's about the autofiction, but they said, when did you discover autofiction and why not memoir?
I don't think that it necessarily. I never actually even see above as a C as autofiction. I don't mind it being called that because I guess a lot of it sort of falls into my experience. So I very quickly, like even like constructing Toni, I think when I started writing her, I didn't really have an idea about her, so she's very much like me. But through, God, I think I did like maybe 7 full redrafts of the novel, and then she's just become her own thing completely. So I don't think I would ever be interested in writing a memoir in the sense that I'm always sort of escaping to like sort of fiction and fantasy words. And that's just I don't think it's a choice, it's just how I write. So even the book has so many elements that are personal to me, like, living in Cardiff, or certain places, bands, etc. But none of the things that happened in the book happened to me, so it's not based on my experience. Obviously, it's always filtered through your emotions and ideas and thinking about the world and self, but it's very much work of fiction, and I think that's just what I write. It's as simple as it is, and so it wasn't like a conscious choice or even sort of thinking about those categories necessarily.
I wonder if there's that thing of like queer immigrant woman as main character, queer immigrant woman as author, must be that bit of you. Is there, if you guys are still being shy, I have a question about language. Oh, you're not being shy. Great. Go for it. So for anyone who is watching online, this is a question about romantic friendships and how they're queer coded, and
God, it's a really interesting question. I guess that's true, and I think it's mostly sort of attributed. I'm not an expert, by the way, so I feel like if I'm cleansing my answer, attributed to queer culture in general, and I don't know if it should be necessarily. I think I don't know. Like, to me, queerness is such a broad term, and that's where sort of its home and its strength lies. And I think the more we sort of try to even categorize these relationships, then we have to label our relationships and sort of categorize the love we feel for people. I don't know, I think it takes a lot away from those relationships, and that's what I sort of wanted to explore as well, the openness of queerness in terms of just identity and relationships. So I guess maybe it's just like a personal choice. If it helps them to categorize it that way, then I think I'd like to give people just the freedom to use those categories in a way that feels empowering and sort of to them. but also not if we don't feel like they are. You know, like just have that choice to, and acceptance, I guess. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I'm not just.
It's interesting because it was something we were talking about before coming up, just that idea of like the restriction of language, but also what language gives us, that we are forced in some ways to use the language of the mainstream, or even within subcultures, there will be a way of understanding something where if you want someone else to understand the way you love, you have to explain it to them with terms that they're already using. And so within that idea of like found family or chosen family or queer platonic love, or because they are fiercely madly in love in this book.
Yeah.
You know, she falls in love with these two gay men in very different ways, and they love her with a physical tenderness, and it is so romantic. And there isn't a language really at the moment, other than talking about queer platonic love or chosen family, that quite captures that love.
Absolutely, exactly. Because yeah, there's so much like physical intimacy that's not sexual, but it's romantic, and the closeness. And you know, I've had relationships in my life where again, like language sort of fails us, because I've had friendships, just for the lack of the vocabulary that we have really, that were at the time much bigger and closer to me than the romantic relationships I was in. So I don't think, but again, romantic relationship always, like you were saying, gets that sort of priority in a way that we talk about relationships in our life. But yeah, that's even when I sort of describe the way to describe this book, and then I say love triangle. And it's always a bit clumsy because everyone's probably just like, what does it mean? You know, but it's very much a love triangle, even though that I wanted to make it clear. I think there was a friend of mine that thought that Gav was bi. Not that, fair enough if he's interpreted as that, but I wanted them definitely to be just two gay men who are romantically, sexually in love with each other and have that relationship, but also have a very romantic relationship with Toni separately. Yeah.
I think you captured that really beautifully. There was another question here.
Where did the idea of Gav being boxer, when did it come in the process, and where did it come from?
Where did it come from for Gav to be a boxer?
I think I've always been interested in masculinity and portrayals of masculinity, and queer masculinity as well. So I wanted to have them sort of very different in the way they sort of portray campness and queerness, but I thought it was just, I wanted Gav to have because when he's introduced to us, he's sort of conventionally quite like camp, and loves Cher, loves Dan, he's glitter on his eyes, but I didn't want him to be, not necessarily to say that's caricature, because it isn't, but I thought it would be interesting to give him, coming from, because he's from the valleys in South Wales, a very sort of traditionally masculine environment, and working class as well, and I thought it would just be interesting to have a Cher loving boxer, because why not, and have also in terms of physicality to have him be the strong sort of stereotypically so strong masculine like body, and be this joyful sort of camp presence in the book.
Yeah, I remember it striking me at the point at which he does punch someone, that capacity for violence that he has wound in his body, that I had failed to see right up until that moment, because even though you describe him as big and muscular and all those other things, that he wasn't a threatening or imposing. He's so joyfully camp, and that I hadn't seen it right up until that moment, and the way you play with masculinity is pretty cool.
It's interesting that we just said, because I think we are sort of surrounded by certain images of gay men, and I think there's sort of stereotypes about in culture and in queer culture as well, in the same way I guess with portrayals of butchness, and it's and I think we can explore, play around with those archetypes in prose so much more, like to, because I think it's exactly that once you've got a few sort of, you've got Share, you've got disco, you do forget, right? Because these are predominant sort of ideas that we are surrounded by. So, yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yeah, go for it.
I've got a bit of a dry question about you said you edited it about 7 times. I just kind of wanted to know what were the hardest bits of the novel that came together for you, and what were the bits you had the most fun with? Because I think the place in the novel, those sort of 3 places it's set in, are almost like characters as well. They're really beautifully drawn. And I grew up in Cardiff as well, so it's like, that was really nice to read something that just like really gets the soul of the place. And when it goes up to the valleys, I was like, oh, that's great, like, that's so how it is. So yeah, I just wanted to know, like, yeah, what were the bits that you had loads of fun with, and what were the bits that you were like, this is testing me quite a lot?
Thank you. Yeah, so the bits that always felt, because I guess I can break into like as a writer, but also just like specifically for this novel. Specifically for this novel, I love just working with those characters, and some are easier than others. So like Gav just leapt off the page for me instantly, and I knew who he was, I think from draft 0. With Karol, it took a while, but once I got him, I think it took a few drafts of, as I sort of redrafted the plot and etc. You sort of get a better grip of your characters, who they are. But once I sort of knew him, I loved writing him. And Toni was probably the most difficult one to write. But I guess it's probably usually the case with protagonists, especially first person, because you have to be so clear in just how you sort of shape them. And in terms of plays, I loved coming back to Cardiff and the valleys, and that are my true second home in this world. So I just knew always I wanted to include those, both of them, in that sort of nostalgic, romanticized way, like my love letter, but it really is. And also as well, I love coming back to a very specific time in my life, and then sort of very specific place as well that I wanted to explore. And that was really fun to do that. I struggled with London because it was meant to be more of a fantasy place. So I never lived in Notting Hill. But also it's meant to be a bit unreal, a bit so that was more of a, I think the second section was the one I redrafted the most. So when I say 7 drafts, probably third section was pretty much ready in draft 1 and 2. Like it hadn't really changed much. First section a little, following the changes, but second section that was a struggle. And as a sort of maybe more general writing, what I always enjoy is emotions and sort of relationships and people and feelings in general, but timelines are the death of me. And working out time, maybe it's sort of being on the ADHD spectrum, that was just, it took me forever to draw out the sort of 2 months later, and it was 2 years later, and so what happened then? And so that was extremely frustrating to work. I was still I'm a bit nervous that it hold itself together in terms of a timeline, because it just,
I find that really surprising, because it was really clear.
My brain just doesn't, it was like, weeks and weeks of just working out and being really meticulous of checking it with, friends, and just, does it make sense? Does this happen and this happened? And that's 6 months later, and
It works. It works. Does anyone else have a question? Okay, then I am going to ask my question about language. We haven't even touched on class, which is like a whole other dimension to the book that is brilliantly explored. But English is your second language.
Yes.
And it is Toni's second language. And there is a bond or a shared connection that she has with Karol that is specific to a shared heritage, a Polishness, language, and yet they find some things they will lean into the English, and then in other places they won't. How is it to, what is your relationship with language, and how did that sort of come into the book?
Oh, hugely. It was a huge part, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to write it as well. A, to sort of maybe challenge just quite like reductive portrayals of Eastern Europeans in like UK culture that I was just a bit fed up with, and I thought, well, if I don't write something, I can't really be annoyed with everyone else for not writing complex like Eastern European characters. And with the language, I thought, because as you sort of, for any sort of people who English is their second language here, you sort of always question yourself, you always sort of question the grammar, question the accent, and there's a huge like struggle of like kind of belonging, non-belonging, and sort of, the longer you're in that second sort of home, the second country, the further away you get from your, native country, and you end up in a really interesting place for a writer, where you sort of home at both, but then sort of you're not really home in either place. So when I would come home to Poland now, I feel quite foreign as well. And my language is like the language from 2009 when I left. So it's quite like clumsy, But then I could never even though my English has evolved with me being here, and I mean it with like sort of, it's not from 2009, because I could continue to live here. It's still, it'll always be different, and I wanted to sort of own it as well and explore it, and for Toni and Karol to own it in their own different ways. And then what I couldn't actually explore in the novel, because it's written in English, is Ponglish, so the sort of how we Polish immigrants talk to each other, which I'd love to explore one day, maybe in a sort of hybrid Polish-English thing. And sort of I think for many immigrants, you are forming a little sort of identity itself, which is being an immigrant. It's not being British, it's not being Polish, it's being an immigrant in a specific country, and that sort of binds you together in that sense. In a similar way as I think queerness does, in that sort of places of belonging, non-belonging, coexisting at once together.
Thank you for that. Was there any last burning question? Did I see any waving hands? No. Then I'm going to call it. But then you can also come and get your book signed and ask any questions that you were too shy to ask from the stage. Ania, thank you for this extraordinarily beautiful novel. Thank you to your publisher who is in the room, to Dead Ink, for always championing brilliant writing, and it is bold and subversive and gorgeous, and I'm so glad it's in the world. Do take home a copy. If you have anyone that has ever mentioned an interest in Wales, or that friend that loves everything Welsh, this is the book. It's such a sense of place. You're so right. It's such a character in the book. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for book fringing with us. Thank you for coming up with us today. And will you join me all in just one last big thank you to Ania Card.
Thank you so much.